I never believed in superstition, not until I took the job at Beacon Point Lighthouse, perched on the jagged cliffs of the Oregon coast, like some monument to man's stubborn defiance of the sea. My name is Eli Carter, and I came here running from failure. A divorce that gutted my savings, a marketing job that evaporated when the company downsized, and the suffocating weight of a life that had crumbled around me in Portland. The lighthouse keeper position was temporary, 6 months through the storm season, but it offered something I desperately needed: isolation, and the kind of honest work that didn't require pretending to care about quarterly projections or social media engagement rates. The lighthouse itself was a relic from 1887. Its white-painted brick walls streaked with rust stains and salt deposits. It rose 93 feet above the Pacific, connected to the mainland by a narrow bridge that spanned a gap where the cliff had eroded away decades ago. The keeper's quarters sat at the base of the tower, 3 small rooms and a kitchen that smelled perpetually of brine and old wood. The furniture was functional but worn: a cast-iron bed, a desk scarred by decades of logbook entries, and shelves lined with water-damaged journals from previous keepers. The man I was replacing, Harold Finch, was 78 years old, with hands like weathered leather and eyes that seemed to look right through you. He'd kept the light for 12 years, longer than most according to the Coast Guard supervisor who'd interviewed me over the phone. Harold showed me the routines with the efficiency of someone eager to leave: how to maintain the LED beacon that had replaced the original Fresnel lens, how to log weather conditions and vessel sightings, how to operate the backup generator when the power lines inevitably failed during storms. But it was on my first evening, as Harold gathered his few belongings, that he slid a yellowed piece of paper into the official logbook without ceremony. The paper was old, its edges brown and brittle, covered in handwriting from different pens and different hands, as if each keeper had added their own notes over the years. "The rules," Harold said simply, not meeting my eyes. "Follow them." I unfolded the paper and read, "Never let the light go out after midnight. Do not open the door if you hear knocking after dusk. If you see a ship's lantern in the fog, do not signal back. Never look directly into the mirror on the 3rd floor. At dawn, always leave an offering on the windowsill for the gulls." I laughed, actually laughed, thinking it was some kind of hazing ritual for new keepers. "Seriously? Ghost stories?" Harold paused at the door, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. For a moment, something flickered across his weathered face. Not amusement, but something closer to pity. "You'll learn," he said quietly. "Or you won't." He left without another word, his footsteps echoing across the bridge until they were swallowed by the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. That first night, I sat at the desk reading through the most recent logbook entries. Harold's handwriting was precise, noting wind speeds, visibility conditions, and the occasional passing vessel, but scattered throughout were odd notations: unusual bird activity at dawn, left extra bread. Or, fog bank approached from northwest. No signals observed. Light maintained. The formal language couldn't quite mask an underlying tension, a careful attention to details that seemed unimportant for lighthouse operations. Why note bird activity? Why mention that no signals were observed, unless signals were somehow expected? As darkness settled over the coast, the lighthouse began to feel different. The isolation I'd sought suddenly felt heavier, more complete than I'd anticipated. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away in the village of Beacon Point, a collection of weathered houses and a single general store that catered to fishermen and the occasional tourist. The lighthouse sat alone on its cliff, connected to the world by a single phone line and a gravel road that became treacherous in winter storms. I climbed to the lamp room at the top of the tower to check the beacon. The LED array cast its beam across the dark ocean in steady rotation, sweeping from the rocky coastline to the empty horizon every 10 seconds. The beam was brilliant white, powerful enough to be seen for 20 miles on a clear night. Tonight, fog was beginning to roll in from the Pacific, creating a wall of grey that seemed to swallow the light just beyond the breaker line. Standing in the lamp room, surrounded by windows on all sides, I felt exposed, as if something in that fog was watching the tower, waiting. It was an irrational thought, born of too many horror movies and the natural human discomfort with isolated places. But the feeling persisted as I made my way back down the spiral stairs. Past the empty third floor with its dust-covered furniture and draped mirror, past the second floor with its small bedroom and bathroom, to the main living area where I'd set up my laptop and tried to convince myself that the satellite internet would be sufficient for staying connected to civilization. Around 10 o'clock, as I was reading through the Lighthouse maintenance manual, I heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping against the tower's exterior walls. At first, I dismissed it as debris carried by the wind, maybe kelp or driftwood thrown up by the waves. But the sound was too regular, too deliberate. Tap, 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 a pause, tap, tap, tap. I went to the window and peered out into the darkness. The fog had thickened, reducing visibility to perhaps 50 feet. Beyond that, everything disappeared into a grey-black void. The tapping continued, seeming to move around the base of the tower, first from the north side, then the east, then the south. I told myself it was the building settling, or perhaps a loose piece of siding responding to the wind pressure. Old buildings made strange noises. There was nothing supernatural about thermal expansion or the effects of constant salt air on metal fixtures. But as I settled into bed that first night, listening to the foghorn from a distant ship and the endless crash of waves against the rocks, I found myself thinking about Harold's expression when he'd handed me those rules. Not the amused look of someone playing a practical joke, but something far more serious, something that looked like fear. On my second night at Beacon Point, the fog rolled in thick enough to turn the lighthouse beam into a diffused glow that barely penetrated 20 feet beyond the lamp room. I was making my evening rounds, checking the beacon rotation, recording weather conditions, ensuring the backup generator was ready in case the power failed, when I heard 3 sharp knocks at the main door. The sound was unmistakable, deliberate, measured human. Knock, knock, knock. I froze halfway up the spiral stairs, my hand gripping the metal railing. The lighthouse sat on a cliff accessible only by the narrow bridge, 3 miles from the nearest house. No one had any reason to visit after dark, especially in weather like this. The Coast Guard would have called ahead. The local sheriff's department knew better than to make unnecessary trips to the lighthouse during fog season. The knocking came again, same rhythm, same intensity. 3 measured raps that seemed to echo through the tower's thick walls. My rational mind immediately began cataloguing explanations. Debris thrown by waves, a loose shutter, perhaps even a lost hiker seeking shelter, but the sound had been too purposeful, too much like knuckles against wood. I descended the stairs slowly, each step creating a small metallic ring in the confined space. The main door was solid oak, reinforced with iron bands, built to withstand the worst storms the Pacific could deliver. It had a small window at eye level, but the glass was so old and salt-stained that it was nearly opaque. I approached cautiously, my hand automatically reaching for the bolt. Then I remembered the rules. Do not open the door if you hear knocking after dusk. I stopped, my fingers inches from the metal slide bolt. It was absurd. If someone was genuinely in distress, if a hiker or fisherman needed help, I was condemning them to a night in the elements. But Harold's expression haunted me, that look of absolute seriousness when he'd handed me the paper. The knocking came a third time, more insistent now. And then I heard something that made my blood turn cold, a voice muffled by the thick door but unmistakably human. "Please," it said. "I'm lost. I need help." The voice was young, female, filled with genuine distress. Every decent instinct I possessed screamed at me to open the door. What kind of person leaves someone outside in weather like this, based on a list of superstitious nonsense? But I didn't move. Something about the voice bothered me. Not what it said, but how it sounded. Too clear, perhaps, for someone supposedly caught in the fog and wind outside. Too perfectly audible through a door built to withstand hurricane-force storms. "Please," the voice came again. "I can see your light. I know you're in there." I backed away from the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. The smart thing would be to call the sheriff's department, let them handle whoever was outside. But the phone was upstairs, and I'd have to pass directly in front of the door to reach it. Instead, I climbed to the lamp room, thinking I could get a better view from above. The beacon continued its steady rotation, cutting through the fog in a predictable pattern. But when the beam swept the area directly in front of the lighthouse, I saw nothing. No lost hiker, no stranded fisherman, just the narrow bridge disappearing into the grey mist. I waited there for nearly an hour, checking each time the beam illuminated the entrance. Nothing. No movement. No sign of human presence. Eventually, the knocking stopped. The voice fell silent. When I finally worked up the courage to descend, I pressed my ear against the door. No sound except the wind and the distant crash of waves. I waited another hour before attempting sleep, every creak of the old building making me jump. Dawn came with its usual parade of seagulls, their harsh cries cutting through the dissipating fog. I'd slept poorly, waking at every sound, but the daylight brought a measure of rational thought. I needed to check outside, to prove to myself that the previous night had been nothing more than acoustic tricks played by an old building in bad weather. I opened the door cautiously, half expecting to find a body on the threshold, some poor soul who'd died while I cowered inside. But there was no one. The bridge was empty, the gravel path undisturbed, except for the footprints. They were clearly visible in the soft earth beside the door, the impressions of bare feet, small and delicate, unmistakably human. The prince approached the door from the bridge, then seemed to pace back and forth on the small landing. But here's what made my hands shake as I crouched to examine them more closely. The prints were soaking wet, as if whoever made them had just emerged from the ocean. I followed the trail as it led away from the door. The wet footprints continued to the edge of the cliff, where they simply ended. Not at the cliff's edge, but at the very lip of the precipice where the land dropped away 90 feet to the rocks below. The prints didn't turn back. They didn't lead to any path or hiding place. They walked straight to the edge of the cliff and vanished, as if whoever made them had simply stepped off into empty air. I spent the rest of that morning trying to rationalize what I'd seen. High tide could have thrown spray high enough to wet the rocks, and perhaps someone could have made the prints earlier, before the fog rolled in. But the prints were crisp, clearly fresh and completely dry except for that inexplicable wetness. That afternoon I called Harold's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice wary. Having second thoughts about the rules, he asked before I could explain why I was calling. "Someone knocked on the door last night," I said, a woman's voice asking for help. But when I looked this morning, there were wet footprints leading to the cliff edge. Harold was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentler than I'd expected. "You didn't open the door. It wasn't a question." "No," I said. "The rules said not to." "Good. That's good, Eli. The first test is always the hardest because it seems the most human, the most reasonable to ignore." "Test? What are you talking about?" But Harold had already hung up. That evening, I took the yellowed paper from the logbook and read through the rules again. They no longer seemed like quaint superstitions or practical jokes played on new keepers. They felt like warnings, written in the careful handwriting of people who'd learned something terrible about the place they were meant to guard. I found myself wondering how many keepers had failed that first test. How many had opened the door to help a lost soul, only to discover that some things that seem human in the dark are anything but. As night settled over Beacon Point once more, I double-checked the bolt on the main door and began my evening rounds with a new understanding. The lighthouse wasn't just guiding ships away from dangerous rocks. It was keeping something else at bay. Mark Daniels arrived on a grey Thursday morning in the third week of my tenure, driving a Coast Guard pickup, loaded with maintenance supplies and an enthusiasm that felt jarring after weeks of solitude. He was 24, fresh from technical school, assigned as my temporary assistant, while the lighthouse underwent its autumn safety inspection and equipment updates. "Man, this place is like something out of a movie," Mark said, hefting a toolbox from the truck bed. He had the kind of effortless confidence that comes from never having encountered anything truly inexplicable. "Bet you've got some great ghost stories already." I helped him carry his gear inside, noting how his presence immediately changed the atmosphere of the keeper's quarters. Where I'd grown accustomed to the weighted silence broken only by wind and waves, Mark filled the space with chatter about his girlfriend in Portland, his plans to eventually work on oil rigs in Alaska, and his theories about why lighthouse keeping attracted weird old hermits. "No offense," he added quickly, grinning, "but you've got to admit it's a pretty isolated gig." That evening, as we worked together, updating the beacon's control systems, I mentioned the rules almost casually, the way you might warn someone about a loose step or a door that sticks. Mark read through the yellowed paper with barely concealed amusement. "Seriously? Never let the light go out after midnight. What do they think happens? The ghost of Christmas past shows up." He handed the paper back with a chuckle. These old-timers really knew how to mess with the new guys' heads. I tried to explain about the knocking, about the wet footprints, but Mark had an answer for everything. Sound carries strangely in fog. Condensation can create moisture patterns that look like tracks. The isolation plays tricks on your mind. Look, Eli, I get it. This place is creepy as hell at night. But you can't seriously believe in ghost rules written by some superstitious keeper from the 1800s. His certainty was almost infectious. In the bright worklights we'd set up to service the beacon, surrounded by digital monitoring equipment and GPS calibration tools, the supernatural seemed as outdated as the oil lamps the lighthouse had once used. Maybe Mark was right. Maybe weeks of solitude had made me susceptible to suggestion, seeing patterns in random events. That sense of rational relief lasted exactly 5 days. On Tuesday night, as a thick fog bank rolled in from the northwest, Mark and I were in the lamp room performing the weekly beacon inspection when we saw it. A flickering yellow light on the horizon, moving slowly parallel to the coast. It bobbed and swayed with the rhythm of waves, unmistakably a lantern hanging from the mast of a small vessel. Jesus, somebody's in trouble out there, Mark said, reaching for the signal lamp controls. In this fog they'll hit the rocks for sure. The lighthouse was equipped with a powerful directional signal lamp for communicating with vessels in distress. Protocol required us to establish contact with any boat showing signs of navigation difficulty and relay their position to Coast Guard rescue services. Wait, I said, grabbing his arm. The rules say not to signal back if we see a ship's lantern in the fog. Mark stared at me as if I'd suggested we sacrifice a goat. Are you insane? There are people out there who need help. Real people, not your imaginary ghost sailors. The lantern continued its slow progress through the fog, perhaps 2 miles offshore. It was clearly struggling, the light dipping and rising more dramatically now, as if the vessel was taking on water or losing power. I'm calling the Coast Guard, I said, reaching for the radio. No time, Mark replied, pushing past me to the signal controls. Look at that light pattern. They're barely staying afloat. Before I could stop him, Mark activated the signal lamp and sent out the standard distress acknowledgement. 3 long flashes, followed by 3 short, followed by 3 long. The message was clear: we see you. Help is coming. The response was immediate. The distant lantern flashed back, not the standard maritime distress pattern, but something else. Something that made my skin crawl because it was an exact mirror of our signal, sent back to us with perfect timing. See? Mark said triumphantly. They're responding. Now we can guide them to safety. But as we watched, something strange happened to the lantern light. It seemed to brighten, growing from a flickering yellow glow to something more intense, more focused. And it was moving, not toward shore as a vessel in distress would, but in a perfect circle around our position. That's not right, Mark said, his confidence wavering for the first time. Boats don't move like that in fog. The circular pattern tightened, the light moving faster now. And then, cutting through the fog and wind, we heard voices calling from the water below. Dozens of voices crying out in distress, calling for help in words that became increasingly clear as they echoed off the cliff face. But one voice stood out above the others. Mark's own voice, identical in tone and timbre, shouting from somewhere in the black water beneath the lighthouse. Help me. Please, somebody help me. I'm drowning. Mark went white, his hand frozen on the signal lamp controls. That's impossible, he whispered. That's my voice. That's exactly my voice. The cries continued, Mark's voice mixed with dozens of others, all pleading for rescue from the churning water below. But we were both standing in the lamp room, 90 feet above the ocean. Mark was beside me, pale and shaking, listening to his own voice scream for help from the darkness. Turn off the light, I said urgently. Cut the signal. But Mark was transfixed, staring down at the invisible water where his voice continued to call out in terror. He started toward the stairs. I have to see. I have to look. No. I grabbed him, but he was younger and stronger, fueled by a panic I recognized, the desperate need to understand something that defied understanding. He broke free and ran for the stairs, taking them 3 at a time in his rush to reach the base of the tower. I followed, shouting at him to stop, to remember the rules, but he was already at the main door, throwing back the bolt I'd carefully secured hours earlier. Mark yanked the door open and stepped out onto the narrow landing. The fog was so thick I could barely see him, just a shadow against the deeper darkness. "Mark," I called, "get back inside." For a moment there was silence. Even the voices from below had stopped. Then Mark spoke, his voice strange and distant. "Eli, you need to see this. There's something in the water." I approached the open door cautiously, every instinct screaming at me not to look. But Mark was my responsibility. If something had happened to him, if he was in some kind of shock, the landing was empty. Mark was gone. I called his name, shining my flashlight into the fog, but there was no response. The narrow bridge stretched away into the grey void, but I couldn't see far enough to tell if he'd crossed it or fallen. I spent the rest of that night calling for him, searching the accessible areas around the lighthouse base, radioing the Coast Guard to report a missing person. By dawn, search and rescue teams were combing the coastline, but they found nothing. No trace of Mark, no indication of where he might have gone. But when the fog lifted that morning, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. At the edge of the cliff, just below the lighthouse, were deep gouges in the rock face, long scratches that looked as if something heavy had been dragged upward from the water. The marks were fresh, cutting through decades of lichen and salt deposits to expose the raw stone beneath. The gouges started at the tide line and ended at the cliff's edge, as if something had climbed up from the ocean, dragging a struggling burden. But there was no path down to those rocks, no way for anyone to have made those marks from below. That afternoon, I found Mark's jacket hanging on a piling near the bridge, soaked through with seawater, despite being nearly 40 feet above the highest tide. In the jacket pocket was a note in Mark's handwriting, but the words made no sense. "The sea remembers what we signal back." I never saw Mark again. The official report listed him as missing, presumed drowned, another tragic accident in the dangerous waters around Beacon Point. But I knew better. I'd seen the rules in action, witnessed the consequences of ignoring them. That night, I took the yellowed paper from the logbook and added my own notation in the margin. "Monsieur Daniels, October 15th, signaled back to Lantern in fog. Lost." I was no longer the skeptical newcomer who'd laughed at superstitious old-timers. I was a believer, a convert to the strange faith that kept lighthouse keepers alive on the Oregon coast, and I was terrified of what other tests might be coming. Mark's disappearance changed everything. What had been an isolated job became a vigil, and the lighthouse transformed from a refuge into something that felt increasingly like a prison, with rules I didn't understand but dared not break. The Coast Guard search lasted 4 days, helicopters sweeping the coastline, while dive teams explored the treacherous waters around the base of the cliff. They found nothing, not Mark's body, not any trace of how he'd vanished from the narrow. Landing outside the main door, the official investigation concluded that he'd likely suffered some kind of disorientation in the fog and fallen from the bridge or cliff. Accidents happened at isolated stations, especially to inexperienced personnel. The paperwork was filed, Mark's family was notified, and life was expected to continue normally. But I couldn't accept that explanation, not after what I'd heard and seen. Mark hadn't fallen. He'd been taken, and the answers, if they existed anywhere, were hidden in the journals that filled the shelves of the keeper's quarters. I began reading systematically, starting with the most recent entries and working backward through decades of lighthouse logs. The official logbooks were dry, professional documents, weather readings, vessel sightings, maintenance notes, but scattered throughout were personal journals, some leather-bound volumes that keepers had brought with them, others simple notebooks purchased from the village store. The patterns emerged slowly, like images developing in a darkroom. Every keeper mentioned the rules, though they were phrased differently in different eras. Some called them protocols, others traditions or local customs. But the substance remained consistent. Don't open the door after dark, don't signal unknown lights in the fog, avoid the third-floor mirror, keep the beacon burning after midnight, appease the gulls at dawn. And every few years someone disappeared. Thomas Henley, a 1962, assistant keeper Walsh opened door during fog, found his boots on rocks below next morning. Body never recovered. Margaret Sullivan, 1978. Signal lamp operator Morrison responded to distress call in heavy fog. Heard his voice calling from water all night. Gone by dawn. James Crawford, 1995. New keeper's wife looked into mirror on third floor, found her standing at cliff edge next morning. No memory of how she got there. Transferred to mainland hospital. Never returned. The phrase "the sea remembers" appeared repeatedly, written in different hands across decades of entries. It was never explained, just referenced, as if everyone understood its meaning. One keeper in 1953 had written, "The sea remembers every soul it's claimed. The light keeps it from claiming more. But only if we follow the rules." But it was a journal from 1913 that provided the first real insight into what haunted Beacon Point. Keeper Edmund Holloway had filled an entire notebook with meticulous observations, written in the precise handwriting of someone trying to document the impossible. The entity appears to be drawn to signals of distress or assistance. Any attempt to communicate with vessels showing unidentified lights results in immediate manifestation. The voices heard afterward are perfect replications, not just sound but emotion, memory, personality, as if the sea has absorbed not just the bodies of the drowned, but their complete essence. The mirror on the third floor acts as a conduit. Direct observation reveals not reflection but submersion. The viewer sees themselves as if underwater, surrounded by the forms of those who have been claimed. Prolonged exposure appears to create a compulsion to join them. The beacon must remain lit after midnight. This is when the entity is most active, most capable of manifesting on land. The light does not harm it, but seems to maintain a boundary it cannot cross while illuminated. The gulls are somehow connected to the entity. They arrive each dawn as if summoned, and their departure indicates safety for the daylight hours. The offerings are not superstition but negotiation, payment for their continued vigilance. Holloway's journal contained detailed sketches, the lighthouse surrounded by strange symbols carved into the rocks, diagrams of light patterns that appeared in the fog, anatomical drawings of things that weren't quite human. The final entry was dated December 21st, 1913. "It's calling my name now. Every night my father's voice from the water. I understand why so many have answered. The loneliness is unbearable, but I will not break. The light must be maintained." Edmund Holloway's name appeared on the official registry as serving until 1914, when he was replaced due to health concerns, but a loose note tucked into his journal, written in different handwriting, told a different story. "Found EH on rocks below tower, December 22nd. No signs of violence. Appeared to have climbed down cliff face in night clothes. Body showed evidence of prolonged submersion, despite being discovered within hours." The more I read, the clearer the picture became. Beacon Point Lighthouse wasn't just guiding ships away from dangerous rocks. It was containing something that had been claiming lives for over a century. The rules weren't superstition. They were a survival protocol developed through trial and error, written in the blood of keepers who'd learned too late what lurked in the waters below. But knowing the history didn't make living with it easier. Each night brought new tests of the rules. I'd hear Mark's voice calling from the fog, perfectly reproduced conversations we'd had, pleading with me to come outside. I'd see lights moving in patterns that defied physics, lanterns that bobbed and weaved through the air as if carried by invisible hands. The third-floor mirror remained covered, but sometimes I'd hear something moving behind the cloth, not footsteps, but the sound of water lapping against glass. Once I found the covering on the floor, soaked with seawater. Though no water had entered the building, the gulls grew bolder, arriving in greater numbers each dawn. Instead of the usual dozen or so, I'd count 30, 40, sometimes more than 50 perched along the lighthouse railing. They no longer scattered when I approached, but watched me with an intelligence that felt uncomfortably human. When I placed bread on the windowsill, they wouldn't eat until I'd retreated inside. Then they'd consume it completely, leaving no crumb behind. I began adding my own observations to the collective record, continuing the work that keepers before me had started. The entity, for lack of a better term, was clearly territorial, bound to the waters around Beacon Point but capable of influencing events on land. It could perfectly replicate human voices and appeared to feed on or collect the essence of those who violated the rules. The lighthouse beams seemed to create a barrier after midnight, which explained why the light could never be allowed to fail during the dark hours. The gulls acted as sentinels, their presence indicating that the entity was dormant during daylight. The mirror served as some kind of viewing portal or communication device, allowing the entity to observe and influence those who looked into it. But the most disturbing discovery came from a journal dated 1887, the year the lighthouse was built. Keeper William Morrison, the first to tend the light at Beacon Point, wrote, "Construction crew reported unusual findings during foundation excavation. Workers refused to continue after discovering submerged cavern system beneath cliff. Something in the water down there, they said. Something that had been waiting. The lighthouse hadn't just been built to guide ships. It had been constructed as a prison, placed specifically above whatever had been found in those underwater caverns. The Fresnel lens, the beacon timing, even the architecture of the tower. Everything had been designed to contain rather than simply illuminate, and for more than a century, that containment had held. But only because each keeper had followed the rules, maintained the barriers, paid the price in isolation and fear. As I closed Morrison's journal and returned it to the shelf, I realized I was no longer just a lighthouse keeper. I was a guardian, the latest in a long line of people who'd accepted the responsibility of keeping something ancient and hungry from claiming more victims. The question that haunted me as I prepared for another night of vigilance was simple. How long could I hold the line before I became another cautionary tale written in the margins of a yellowed rulebook? Outside, the fog was rolling in again, and somewhere in its grey depths I could hear voices calling my name. Maeve O'Brien arrived on the first Tuesday of November, driving her battered pickup along the treacherous gravel road that connected the lighthouse to the outside world. I'd been expecting her. The supply schedule indicated monthly deliveries of food, fuel, and equipment, but I wasn't prepared for the woman who stepped from the truck with the casual confidence of someone completely comfortable in a place that terrified me. She was perhaps 60, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes the color of storm clouds. Her hands were weathered from decades of coastal living, but her movements were precise, economical. She began unloading supplies without introduction, as if we were old acquaintances continuing a familiar routine. "You're the new keeper," she said, hefting a bag of flour from the truck bed. It wasn't a question. "Eli Carter," I replied, moving to help with the heavier boxes. "I've been here about 6 weeks." "I know." She paused, studying my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "You've got the look." "What look?" "The one they all get after the first month. Like you've seen something that doesn't fit with the way the world's supposed to work." She handed me a box of canned goods. Harold had it when he started. Took him 3 years to stop jumping at shadows. We worked in silence for several minutes, carrying supplies into the keeper's quarters. Maeve moved through the lighthouse with the familiarity of someone who'd been here many times before, but she avoided looking directly at the 3rd floor and kept her distance from the narrow windows that faced the ocean. "I knew your predecessor," she said finally, as we finished stacking provisions in the kitchen. "Mark Daniels, nice boy. Terrible thing what happened." Something in her tone suggested she knew more about Mark's disappearance than the official reports indicated. "Did you know him well?" "Well enough to warn him." Maeve settled into one of the wooden chairs at the kitchen table, her expression grave. "Same warning I'm giving you. The sea doesn't forget and it doesn't forgive. Your job isn't just to keep ships from the rocks. It's to keep the rocks from claiming more ships." She spoke with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing the weather, but her words carried an undercurrent of absolute certainty that made my skin crawl. "You know about the rules," I said. "It wasn't a question. I wrote half of them." Maeve reached into her jacket and withdrew a thermos, unscrewing the cap, to pour steaming coffee into 2 cups she'd somehow known to bring. "My husband kept this light for 15 years. Learned the hard way what happens when you don't follow protocol. What happened to him?" Maeve was quiet for a long moment, staring out the small kitchen window toward the grey ocean beyond. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of old grief. Sean thought he was smarter than the rules, thought he could find a way to fight back instead of just holding the line. Started experimenting, timing the beacon differently, trying to track the patterns in the fog, mapping the underwater caverns with diving equipment he ordered from Portland. She sipped her coffee, and I noticed her hands were trembling slightly. One night in February, thick fog, he decided to go down to the caverns during low tide, said he was going to confront whatever was down there, put an end to the whole business. I begged him not to go, but Sean was stubborn. Said 20 years of following superstitious rules was enough. And He never came back up. Found his diving gear the next morning, laid out neat as you please on the rocks below the lighthouse. But Sean, she shook her head. Sean was standing at the edge of the cliff, staring out at the water like he was waiting for something. When I called his name, he turned around and his eyes... Maeve's voice trailed off and she took another sip of coffee before continuing. Wasn't Sean anymore. Something else looking out through his face. It smiled at me. Not a human smile, but the kind of expression a shark might make if it could express pleasure. Then it walked off the cliff like it was stepping into a swimming pool. The kitchen felt suddenly colder, despite the warmth from the wood stove. How long ago? 12 years! I've been bringing supplies here ever since, watching keepers come and go, some lasting longer than others. You're the first in a while who's made it past the first month without breaking. Others have broken the rules. Mark Daniels wasn't the first assistant to answer voices in the fog. Won't be the last either. The thing down there, it learns. Gets better at mimicking, at finding the words that make you want to help. Used to be it could only copy voices of people who'd drowned. Now it can imitate anyone you've ever cared about. She leaned forward, her storm-grey eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that was almost hypnotic. That's why the rules exist. Eli, they're not suggestions or traditions. They're the terms of a truce that's kept this coast from becoming a graveyard. Every keeper who's lasted more than a season understands that. You're not fighting the thing in the water. You're negotiating with it. Negotiating what? Boundaries. The lighthouse stays lit after midnight. It doesn't come onto land. You don't signal back to unknown lights. It doesn't lure more ships onto the rocks. You feed the gulls, they warn you when it's active. You avoid the mirror. It doesn't show you things that'll drive you mad. Maeve finished her coffee and stood, moving to the window that overlooked the bridge leading back to the mainland. But the most important rule, the one that's not written down anywhere, is that you don't try to understand it completely. Don't try to communicate with it. Don't try to bargain with it directly, and for God's sake, don't try to help it. Help it? Sean thought he could end the stalemate by giving the thing what it wanted. Thought if he offered himself as a willing sacrifice, it would leave the lighthouse alone. Instead, it got exactly what it had been working toward for decades. A keeper who'd voluntarily break the rules. She turned from the window, her expression sad but resolute. The thing in the water isn't evil in any way we'd understand. It's hungry. It's been hungry for longer than this lighthouse has existed, longer than humans have sailed these waters. The rules don't stop it from feeding. They just control where and when it feeds. As Maeve prepared to leave, loading her empty supply containers back into the truck, she paused at the door. One more thing. Eli, when it calls your name, and it will, don't answer. Even if it sounds like someone you love, someone you've lost, someone you'd do anything to see again. That's when it's most dangerous, when it's learned enough about you to know exactly what voice will make you break. How do you know so much about it? Maeve smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. Because it still calls to me sometimes using Sean's voice. Tells me he's waiting down there in the dark, that he needs me to join him. 12 years, and I still have to bite my tongue to keep from answering. She climbed into her truck and started the engine, but rolled down the window before driving away. The rules aren't punishment, Eli, they're mercy. The thing down there could take this lighthouse anytime it wanted, could drag the whole structure into the sea and add every keeper's soul to its collection. But it doesn't. It follows the rules same as we do, because the rules serve its purpose too, which is patience. It's been waiting for something for a very long time. And every keeper who breaks, every assistant who answers the voices in the fog, every person who stares too long into that mirror, they all bring it a little closer to getting what it wants. The truck disappeared into the November gloom, leaving me alone with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. But as night fell and the fog began to roll in from the Pacific, I found myself thinking about Maeve's final words. What could something that ancient and patient possibly be waiting for? And what would happen to the world above when it finally got what it wanted? Outside, the gulls were gathering in unusual numbers, perching along every available surface of the lighthouse, with an alertness that suggested something was different about this particular night. Something was coming. The storm hit Beacon Point on November 15th, a Pacific tempest that turned the lighthouse into a lonely island, surrounded by chaos. Waves crashed against the cliff face with enough force to shake the entire structure. sending spray past the lamp room windows 90 feet above sea level. The power had failed twice, forcing me to rely on the backup generator. While rain driven by 80 miles per hour, winds found every gap in the lighthouse's century-old construction. I was checking the beacon rotation for the third time that evening when I heard the voice, "Eli, Eli, please help me." It came from outside the main door, barely audible above the howling wind, but unmistakably clear. My ex-wife's voice, Sarah, with the same slight crack in her tone she'd always had when she was frightened or upset. I froze halfway down the spiral stairs, my hand gripping the metal railing until my knuckles went white. Sarah lived in Seattle, 300 miles from the Oregon coast. There was no possible way she could be outside the lighthouse during a storm that had closed every road and grounded every aircraft within 50 miles. But the voice came again, and this time it carried words that made my heart stop. "I'm pregnant, Eli. I need you. Please don't leave me out here." The pregnancy had been the beginning of the end for our marriage. Sarah had miscarried in the 6th month, and the grief had torn us apart in ways we couldn't repair. She'd wanted to try again immediately. I'd been too afraid of losing another child. The fights had grown worse, the silences longer, until she'd finally packed her things and moved in with her sister. "Eli, the baby's coming. Something's wrong. Please." Every rational part of my mind knew this was impossible. Sarah had made it clear in our divorce proceedings that she never wanted to see me again. She'd changed her phone number, blocked me on social media, built a new life that explicitly excluded me. But the voice outside carried such genuine distress, such desperate need, that my hand was moving toward the door bolt before I consciously decided to act. I stopped inches from the metal latch, remembering Mark's fate, remembering every journal entry that described the perfect mimicry the entity could achieve. But this wasn't just any voice, this was Sarah, using knowledge that only she and I shared, speaking about the loss that had destroyed our marriage. "I'm scared. Eli, the contractions started an hour ago and there's so much blood. I need to get to a hospital." The detail was what broke my resolve. Sarah had described her miscarriage in exactly those terms, the sudden onset of contractions, the shocking amount of blood. No one else knew those specific details. We'd never told our families exactly what had happened, had simply said there had been complications. I reached for the bolt with shaking hands, then stopped as another memory surfaced. Maeve's warning: when it calls your name, and it will, don't answer. Even if it sounds like someone you love, someone you've lost, someone you'd do anything to see again, but how could something in the ocean know about the pregnancy? How could it replicate not just Sarah's voice, but her memories, her experiences? "Please, Eli, I know I hurt you. I know I said things I can't take back. But this is our baby, our second chance." The words were perfectly chosen, addressing every regret I'd carried since the divorce. The entity, if that's what this was, had somehow learned the exact emotional leverage needed to make me abandon the rules. I stood there for what felt like hours, my hand hovering over the bolt, while Sarah's voice grew increasingly desperate outside. She described pain in clinical detail, begged me to call an ambulance, promised that if I helped her now, we could try again to make our marriage work. But gradually, I began to notice inconsistencies. Sarah had always called me Ellis when she was upset, never the shortened Eli that everyone else used. She would have asked for her sister first, not me. And the baby she described was a boy, but our lost child had been a girl, something we'd known from the ultrasound. The voice outside was perfect in its emotional manipulation, but flawed in its details. It knew about the pregnancy and the miscarriage, but not the intimate specifics that would have convinced me completely. It was as if the entity could absorb surface thoughts and memories, but couldn't access the deeper, more personal elements that defined real relationships. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering as Sarah's voice grew angry, accusatory. "You're just going to let me die out here? Let your child die? What kind of man are you?" The guilt was overwhelming, but I forced myself to climb the stairs to the lamp room, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the voice that sounded so much like my ex-wife. From the windows I could see nothing in the storm, just walls of rain and spray illuminated by the lighthouse beam. Sarah's voice followed me up the stairs, somehow audible throughout the tower, despite the thick walls and howling wind. But as the hours passed, it began to change. The pleas for help became threats, Promises of forgiveness turned to vows of revenge. By midnight, the voice had become something else entirely, still using Sarah's tone and inflection, but speaking words she would never have used, describing punishments and torments that revealed the true nature of what lurked in the water below. When dawn finally came, the storm had passed, leaving behind the usual debris of seaweed and driftwood. But at the base of the lighthouse door, I found something that made my blood run cold. A hospital bracelet, the kind given to maternity patients, with Sarah's name and a date from 3 years ago, the date of our miscarriage. The bracelet was soaking wet and covered in barnacles, as if it had been underwater for years. But somehow, impossibly, the plastic was still flexible, the printed information still legible. I stared at it for a long time, trying to understand how the entity could have obtained something so specific, so personal. The answer came to me as I remembered the gouges in the cliff face after Mark's disappearance, the scratches that suggested something had climbed up from the water. The entity wasn't just mimicking voices, it was scavenging memories, possessions, pieces of identity from everyone who'd ever drowned in these waters. Sarah had never been to the Oregon coast, but someone wearing her hospital bracelet, perhaps a woman who'd lost a child and couldn't bear the reminder, had ended up in the waters around Beacon Point. The entity had claimed not just her life, but her memories, her grief, her most intimate losses. That afternoon I climbed to the 3rd floor for the first time since my arrival. The mirror stood against the far wall, covered by the heavy cloth I'd never had the courage to remove. But now I needed to understand what I was facing, what had learned enough about human pain to weaponize it so effectively. I approached the mirror slowly, my hand shaking as I grasped the edge of the covering cloth. Every instinct screamed at me to walk away, to leave the mirror shrouded and safe. But I'd passed the point where ignorance offered any protection. I pulled away the cloth in one quick motion. The reflection that stared back at me wasn't my own face. It was Sarah, standing in what looked like a hospital room, holding a baby that should have been born but never was. Behind her, the room was flooded with dark water, and in that water moved shapes that had once been human. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all reaching toward the surface with desperate, grasping hands. Sarah's reflection looked directly at me and spoke, her voice carrying clearly despite the glass between us. "You could have saved us, Eli. You could have opened the door." I threw the cloth back over the mirror and fled downstairs, but the image remained burned into my mind. The entity hadn't just absorbed the memories of the drowned, it had absorbed their regrets, their unfinished business, their desperate need for the things they'd lost. And it was using that collective grief as a weapon, finding the exact emotional pressure point that would make each keeper break the rules and join the growing collection of souls beneath the waves. As I sat in the kitchen that evening, updating my journal with the night's events, I realized I'd crossed a threshold. The entity now knew exactly how to manipulate me, had seen into the deepest corners of my grief and loss. The next test would be worse, more personal, more difficult to resist. But I also understood something else. The rules weren't just protecting me from the entity. They were protecting the entity from me. Because if I ever broke completely, if I ever gave in to the voices and joined the collection beneath the waves, I'd bring with me everything I knew about lighthouse operations, about the beacon timing, about the delicate balance that kept the entity contained. The prison would become the prisoner's tool, and something that had been waiting patiently for over a century would finally be free to expand beyond the waters of Beacon Point. Outside, the gulls were gathering again, more of them than I'd ever seen before. They perched on every surface of the lighthouse, silent and watchful, as if they knew that the final test was approaching. The storm that began on December 3rd was unlike anything in the lighthouse's recorded history. Weather reports had predicted a severe Pacific low-pressure system. But what struck Beacon Point was something altogether more violent, a tempest that seemed to focus its fury specifically on the lighthouse, as if the ocean itself had risen up in rebellion. By the 3rd night, waves were crashing over the lamp room windows, an impossibility given the lighthouse's height above sea level. The backup generator had failed, leaving me dependent on the manual hand crank system that had been installed as a final fail-safe in the 1920s. My arms ached from maintaining the beacon rotation, But I didn't dare let the light fail, not with the entity so clearly active. The storm had been building for 3 days, but it was at 11:47 p.m. on December 5th that everything went wrong. I was in the lamp room, hand-cranking the beacon mechanism, when a massive wave struck the lighthouse with enough force to crack several of the reinforced windows. Salt water sprayed through the gaps, soaking the electrical systems and causing the LED array to flicker ominously. Then, at 11:52 p.m., 8 minutes before midnight, the beacon died completely. The darkness that followed was absolute, pressing against the lighthouse like a living thing. I fumbled for my emergency flashlight, but even its beam seemed swallowed by the unnatural blackness surrounding the tower. From below came a sound I'd never heard before, a deep, resonant groaning that seemed to rise from the ocean floor itself. The lighthouse began to vibrate, not with the force of waves, but with something else, something that made the century-old structure sway as if it were built on quicksand rather than solid rock. I grabbed the manual maintenance kit and began tearing apart the beacon assembly, desperate to find the problem. Water had shorted the main power coupling, but I could bypass it if I could reroute the current through the emergency circuits. My hands shook as I stripped wires and spliced connections, working by flashlight, while the lighthouse groaned and swayed around me. The sound from below grew louder, joined now by other noises, scraping, scratching, as if something massive was climbing the exterior walls of the lighthouse. Through the cracked windows, I could see nothing but absolute darkness, but I could hear the sound getting closer, rising from the base of the tower toward the lamp room. At 5 minutes past midnight, the knocking began, but this wasn't the measured human knocking I'd heard before. This was dozens of hands, maybe hundreds, beating against every surface of the lighthouse simultaneously. The walls, the windows, the door, the metal framework of the beacon assembly, everything resonated with the sound of desperate pounding, and with the knocking came voices. Not just one or two, but a chorus of everyone who had ever been claimed by the waters around Beacon Point. I heard Mark calling for help, Harold Finch reciting maintenance procedures, Sarah begging me to save our unborn child. But beneath those familiar voices was something else, older voices, speaking in languages I didn't recognize, crying out in words that predated English, predated any human tongue I'd ever heard. The lighthouse began to tilt. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift in the angle of the floor. But it grew more pronounced as the structure leaned toward the ocean. The entity was pulling the entire lighthouse into the sea, using the combined strength of every soul it had claimed over the decades. I had perhaps 2 minutes before the beacon would be too tilted to function, before the lighthouse would topple into the churning water below. The beacon had to be relit before that happened, or everything, the lighthouse, the rules, the centuries-old balance that kept the entity contained, would be lost. But I couldn't get the electrical system to work. Every splice I made was immediately soaked by spray, coming through the broken windows. The manual crank wouldn't engage properly with the lighthouse tilting. The backup power cell was completely drained. In desperation, I remembered reading about the original beacon, how it had used an oil flame before electricity, how keepers had maintained the light through manual effort and determination. The modern LED array was dead, but the metal framework, the mirrors, the focusing apparatus, all of that was still intact. I needed fire. I ran downstairs to the living quarters, the lighthouse tilting further with each step. Books, furniture, everything loose was sliding toward the ocean-facing wall. I grabbed the maintenance manual, the logbooks, the journals of previous keepers, anything that would burn. Back in the lamp room, I tore pages from the books and stuffed them into the center of the LED housing, creating a makeshift torch, but I needed something more, something that would burn bright enough and long enough to create a real beacon. My eyes fell on the yellowed paper with the rules, still clutched in my shaking hand, the rules themselves. The accumulated wisdom of a century of lighthouse keeping, written in the handwriting of men and women who had given their lives to maintain the boundary between land and sea. I hesitated. Burning the rules felt like destroying the last connection to everyone who had held this line before me. But what good were written rules if there was no lighthouse left to enforce them? I held the paper to the flame of my lighter and watched it catch. The old parchment burned quickly, but with a bright, clean flame that ignited the pages stuffed around it. Within seconds, I had a fire burning in the heart of the beacon assembly. The mirrors caught the flame and amplified it, projecting a wavering but visible light out across the dark ocean. It wasn't the steady, precise beam of the modern LED system, but it was light, real light at the proper height during the crucial hours after midnight. The effect was immediate. The knocking stopped. The voices fell silent. The lighthouse stopped tilting and began slowly to right itself, but my makeshift beacon was burning through its fuel quickly. The maintenance manuals were already consumed, and the journals were catching one by one. I needed more material to keep the flame alive until dawn. I looked around the lamp room desperately, then made a decision that felt like tearing out part of my soul. I began feeding my own possessions to the fire. Photographs from my marriage, letters from friends, the few personal items I'd brought to make the lighthouse feel like home. Each item that burned took a piece of my past with it, but the beacon grew brighter. The flame reflected off the mirrors and Fresnel lenses, casting the traditional lighthouse beam across the churning water below. And in that light, I saw them, hundreds of figures rising from the ocean, their pale forms visible just beneath the surface of the dark water. They moved in slow, synchronized patterns, like dancers performing an ancient ritual. At the center of the formation was something larger, something that hurt to look at directly, a shape that suggested vast tentacles or maybe flowing fabric, or perhaps just the movement of water itself given consciousness and purpose. The entity, revealed at last in the light of my desperate beacon. But as I watched, the figures began to sink back beneath the waves, retreating from the illuminated waters around the lighthouse. The entity pulsed once, a movement that sent waves rippling outward in perfect circles, and then it too descended into the depths, leaving behind only the normal chaos of storm-tossed seas. I maintained the fire until dawn, feeding it with everything burnable I could find in the lamp room. When the first gulls appeared on the horizon, I finally allowed the flame to die, confident that daylight would provide the protection I needed to assess the damage and plan repairs. The lighthouse had survived, tilted back to its proper position, as if the night's events had been nothing more than a vivid nightmare. But the cracks in the windows remained, and the salt stains on the walls testified to how close I'd come to losing everything. More importantly, I'd learned something crucial about the entity and the rules that contained it. The creature in the water wasn't just following an arbitrary agreement. It was bound by forces more fundamental than human negotiation. The light itself, properly maintained at the proper time, created a barrier it literally could not cross. But I'd also learned that the entity was growing stronger, more capable of direct action than any keeper before me had recorded. The storm, the tilting lighthouse, the coordinated assault on the beacon, none of that appeared in the century of journals I'd read. Something was changing in the waters around Beacon Point, and I was no longer sure that the old rules would be enough to contain what was stirring in the depths below. As I swept up the ashes of the rules and journals I'd burned to save the lighthouse, I realized that I was no longer just following the protocols established by previous keepers. I was writing new ones. The Coast Guard inspection team arrived 3 days after the storm, their crisp uniforms and clipboard efficiency a jarring contrast to the battle-scarred lighthouse they'd come to evaluate. They catalogued the damage with professional detachment: 11 cracked windows, water damage to the electrical systems, structural stress fractures in the lamp room housing. "Worst storm damage we've seen here in 20 years, said Commander Walsh, a trim woman in her 40s, who spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to unusual situations. "You're lucky the whole structure didn't come down." I nodded and made appropriate responses, but I was thinking about how inadequate their explanation was. Storm damage didn't account for the perfect handprints I'd found pressed into the exterior walls 30 feet above the highest tide line. It didn't explain why the metal framework of the beacon assembly had been bent in ways that suggested enormous pressure applied from the inside out. The repair crew worked for 5 days, replacing windows and rewiring the electrical systems while I maintained the light using a temporary portable beacon. They were efficient, professional, and completely unaware that they were restoring a prison rather than simply fixing a lighthouse. During their stay, I kept the rules journal locked away and spoke carefully about the storm damage. These were practical people dealing with a practical problem. They didn't need to know about the voices in the fog or the shapes I'd seen beneath the water. But on their final night, as the crew chief was packing up his tools, he mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "Strangest thing about this job," he said, "coiling electrical cable with practiced efficiency. Usually after a big storm like that, we find debris everywhere, seaweed, driftwood, dead fish thrown up by the waves. But this place is clean as a whistle, almost like the ocean took everything back." I thought about that observation as I watched their truck disappear down the gravel road the next morning. The entity had been more active during the December storm than in any previous recorded incident, but it had also been more careful to leave no evidence. It was learning, adapting, becoming more sophisticated in its approach to the boundary between its domain and the human world. The temporary beacon was replaced with a new LED array, more powerful than the original and equipped with battery backups that could maintain the light for up to 72 hours without external power. The Coast Guard had learned from the near disaster, though they attributed the beacon failure to equipment malfunction rather than supernatural assault. As winter deepened, I settled into a routine that felt like an armed truce. The entity tested the boundaries regularly, voices calling from the fog, lights moving in impossible patterns offshore, wet footprints that appeared and vanished without explanation. But the incidents felt more like reconnaissance than direct assault, as if the creature was studying the lighthouse's new defenses and planning its next move. I began keeping a new kind of journal, one that focused not just on supernatural events, but on the subtle changes I was noticing in the environment around Beacon Point. The gulls were arriving earlier each dawn and staying later into the evening, as if their vigil was extending beyond the traditional daylight hours. The tide seemed higher than the charts predicted, reaching further up the cliff face with each cycle. Most disturbing was the mirror on the 3rd floor. Despite keeping it covered, I could hear activity behind the cloth, not just the sound of water but voices speaking in languages I couldn't identify. The conversations were too muffled to understand, but their rhythm suggested planning, coordination, preparation for something larger than the isolated incidents I'd been experiencing. 3 months after the storm, Maeve made her regular supply run, but this time she brought more than food and equipment. She carried a wooden box filled with items I didn't recognize, carved stones inscribed with symbols that predated any alphabet I knew, candles made from materials that didn't seem entirely natural, and a collection of metal objects that looked like ritual implements. "From the original keepers," she explained, setting the box on the kitchen table with reverent care. "The ones who built this place knew they weren't just constructing a lighthouse. They were building a containment facility." She showed me how to arrange the carved stones around the base of the lighthouse, each one positioned at a specific compass point and buried exactly 3 feet into the rocky soil. The candles were to be lit during the new moon, their smoke creating what she called barriers of intent that reinforced the lighthouse's primary function. "The entity is testing the limits," Maeve said, as we worked together to place the stones. "Every few decades it gets restless, pushes harder against the boundaries. Usually that's when keepers start disappearing more frequently." "How do you know all this?" "Because I've been watching this place for 40 years, she replied, tamping soil around a stone carved with spirals that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. "My grandmother worked here before the lighthouse was even built, when this was just a fishing village that lost too many boats to storms that shouldn't have existed. The ritual implements were more complex, requiring precise timing and movements that Maeve demonstrated with the fluid competence of long practice. They weren't quite religious ceremonies and weren't quite scientific procedures, something that fell between faith and technology, drawing on traditions that predated both. The original builders weren't just architects," she explained, as she showed me how to use a bronze disc inscribed with astronomical calculations. "They were scholars who understood that some problems require solutions that exist outside normal human experience." As we completed the protective rituals, I felt a subtle change in the atmosphere around the lighthouse. The oppressive weight that had been building since the December storm seemed to lift slightly, replaced by something that felt more like watchful calm than active hostility. But the relief was temporary. That night, as I made my routine check of the beacon, I noticed something that made my heart race. The light beam was bending, not the normal refraction caused by fog or atmospheric conditions, but an actual curvature in the beam itself, as if the light was being pulled downward toward the ocean. The effect was subtle but unmistakable. The straight line of illumination that should have extended to the horizon was curving like water flowing downhill. I climbed to the lamp room and checked the LED array, but the equipment was functioning normally. The beam was being distorted by something external, something that was growing stronger than the lighthouse's ability to maintain its protective boundary. Over the following weeks, the distortion grew more pronounced. The beam curved further toward the water each night, and on several occasions, I saw the light actually touch the ocean's surface, creating a pillar of illumination that extended from the lighthouse down to the waves below. When that happened, the water beneath the beam would begin to glow with its own phosphorescence, and shapes would move within that underwater light, the familiar figures I'd seen during the storm, but more of them now, organized in formations that suggested military precision. The entity was using the lighthouse beam as a beacon for its own purposes, calling in reinforcements or resources from deeper waters. The protective barrier was being transformed into a tool of summoning, and I was running out of options to prevent it. On the night of February 14th, exactly 2 months after the repair crew had left, I made a decision that violated every protocol I'd learned during my months at Beacon Point. I turned off the light. The darkness that followed was immediate and absolute. But it was natural darkness, the simple absence of illumination, rather than the supernatural void I'd experienced during the storm. The ocean returned to its normal black expanse, and the phosphorescent glow beneath the waves faded away. For the first time since the December storm, Beacon Point felt like a normal lighthouse on a normal coast, but I knew I'd only bought time. The entity was still there, still growing stronger, still testing the boundaries that kept it contained. By morning, I'd have to relight the beacon and resume the endless vigil that every keeper before me had maintained. As dawn approached and the first gulls appeared on the horizon, I began composing the letter I hoped I'd never have to write. The Coast Guard needed to know what they were really maintaining at Beacon Point, even if they couldn't officially acknowledge it. Future keepers needed better preparation than a list of cryptic rules and a pile of water-damaged journals. But mostly I wrote because I was no longer certain I could hold the line indefinitely. The entity was evolving, adapting, growing stronger with each passing season. Eventually, it would find a way to overcome the lighthouse's defenses. And when that happened, the world needed to be ready. Outside, the gulls were screaming in numbers I'd never heard before, their cries carrying a note of urgency that suggested time was running shorter than any of us realized. I lit the beacon for another day, but I no longer believed that the old rules would be enough to contain what was stirring in the depths below Beacon Point. Something was coming to the surface, and I was the only thing standing in its way. Spring came early to the Oregon coast that year, bringing with it an unusually calm sea and skies so clear they seemed almost artificial after months of storms and fog. But the peaceful weather felt ominous rather than welcoming, like the silence that precedes an earthquake, or the stillness before a tornado touches down. I'd been at Beacon Point for 8 months when the letter arrived from the Coast Guard, informing me that my replacement had been selected and would arrive within the week. My contract was complete, my service record exemplary, and I was free to return to whatever life I'd been living before accepting the lighthouse keeper position. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd come to Beacon Point running from failure and isolation, seeking solitude to rebuild my life. Now I was leaving with knowledge that isolated me more completely than any physical distance ever could. How do you return to normal human society when you know that ancient hungers lurk beneath the waves, held in check only by rules written in the blood of people who died protecting a world that didn't believe they existed? Sarah Ketch arrived on a Thursday morning in early April, driving the same Coast Guard pickup that had brought Mark Daniels to his doom months earlier. She was 29, recently graduated from the Merchant Marine Academy. With the kind of bright enthusiasm that I remembered having once, back when the world seemed comprehensible and supernatural, threats were nothing more than stories told around campfires. "This place is incredible," she said, hefting her duffel bag from the truck, while staring up at the lighthouse with obvious admiration. "I've wanted to work at a remote station like this since I was a kid. The isolation, the responsibility, the history, it's everything I hoped it would be." I helped her carry her belongings inside, watching as she examined the keeper's quarters with the careful attention of someone planning to make the space her own. She asked intelligent questions about the beacon maintenance, the weather monitoring equipment, the communication protocols. Her competence was reassuring and terrifying in equal measure. That evening, as I walked her through the daily routines and showed her the location of emergency supplies, I struggled with how much to tell her. The official Lighthouse manual covered the technical aspects of the job, but said nothing about the supernatural challenges she would face. The unofficial rules existed, but I'd burned the original document during the December storm. There are some local customs you should be aware of, I said finally, as we finished checking the beacon rotation. Traditions that previous keepers have followed. Sarah laughed, the sound bright and natural in the lamproom that had witnessed so much fear. Like what? Throwing coins into the ocean for good luck? I'd rewritten the rules from memory, capturing not just the original 5 commandments, but the additional protocols I'd learned through bitter experience. The new list was longer, more detailed, annotated with explanations that I hoped would help Sarah understand the seriousness of what she was inheriting. But as I handed her the folded paper, I realized that knowledge alone wouldn't be enough. Every keeper had to discover the truth for themselves, had to experience the supernatural reality of Beacon Point before they could truly understand what they were facing. My words were just words until the voices started calling from the fog. These seem pretty specific, Sarah said, reading through the list with growing puzzlement. Never let the light go out after midnight. Don't signal back to unknown lights. What happens if you break these rules? Bad things, I said simply. People disappear. The lighthouse itself is threatened. Just follow them, Sarah. Promise me you'll follow them, especially during your first few months. She studied my face with the careful attention of someone trained to read weather patterns and navigation hazards. You're serious about this? Dead serious. Sarah folded the paper and tucked it into her jacket pocket. Okay, Eli. I'll follow your mysterious lighthouse keeper rules, but you have to tell me the story behind them someday. Someday, I agreed, knowing that by the time she was ready to hear the full truth, she'd have stories of her own to tell. That night, I packed my few remaining possessions while Sarah slept in the second-floor bedroom. Most of my belongings had been consumed by the fire I'd used to maintain the beacon during the December storm. So there wasn't much to take, just some clothes, a few books, and the journal I'd kept documenting my experiences at Beacon Point. I spent the pre-dawn hours making one final entry in the official Lighthouse log, recording weather conditions and equipment status with the same professional detachment that Harold Finch had maintained during his years of service. But in my personal journal, I wrote a different kind of record, a letter to Sarah and to whoever might come after her, explaining what they would face and how to survive it. The gulls arrived at dawn as they always did, but this time they seemed to be watching me specifically, their bright eyes tracking my movements with an intelligence that felt almost human. When I placed bread on the windowsill for the final time, they waited until I'd stepped back before approaching, a courtesy they'd never shown before. Sarah emerged from the lighthouse as I was loading my truck, still rubbing sleep from her eyes, but alert enough to notice the unusual behavior of the birds. They seem very well trained, she observed. Watching the gulls systematically consume every crumb I'd left for them. They're good neighbors, I said. Take care of them and they'll take care of you. She nodded, probably assuming I was speaking metaphorically about the value of maintaining local wildlife populations. In time, she'd learned that the relationship between the lighthouse keeper and the gulls was far more literal and vital than she could imagine. As I prepared to drive away from Beacon Point for the last time, Sarah asked the question I'd been dreading. Any advice for my first night alone? I looked back at the lighthouse, its white walls gleaming in the morning sun, its beacon dark until evening came again. It looked like exactly what it was supposed to be, a navigation aid, a safety beacon, a tool for guiding ships away from dangerous rocks. Nothing about its appearance suggested the supernatural forces contained within its walls. Trust your instincts, I said finally. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And remember, the rules aren't suggestions. They're the difference between survival and becoming another cautionary tale in the lighthouse logs. Sarah smiled, still thinking I was speaking in colorful metaphors about the dangers of isolated work environments. I'll be careful, Eli, and thanks for everything. This place feels like it's in good hands. As I drove down the gravel road that connected Beacon Point to the outside world, I caught one last glimpse of the lighthouse in my rearview mirror. Sarah was standing on the narrow bridge, waving goodbye with the casual confidence of someone who believed the biggest challenge she'd face would be equipment maintenance and weather monitoring. By the time I reached the main highway, the lighthouse had disappeared behind the coastal hills, but I could still see its presence in my mind, a white tower standing guard over dark waters, tended by another keeper who would soon learn that some jobs require more than technical competence and professional dedication. They require a willingness to stand watch against things that shouldn't exist, following rules that make no sense until the moment they save your life. 6 months later, I received a letter postmarked from Beacon Point. The handwriting was shaky, the paper water-stained, but the message was clear. Eli, you were right about the rules. All of them. Thank you for the warning. The voices started during my second week, but I didn't answer. The light failed during a storm last month, but I managed to relight it using your journal notes. I've added some observations of my own. The entity is definitely getting stronger, but the containment is holding. For now. I understand why keepers don't usually talk about this job. Who would believe us? Sarah. I kept that letter along with the journal I'd maintained during my months at Beacon Point. Someday, when Sarah's replacement arrives, she'll need to know what she's really signing up for. The cycle continues, and the watch must be maintained, because somewhere on the Oregon coast, in waters too deep for sunlight to penetrate, something ancient and hungry continues to wait. And the only thing standing between that patient darkness and the world above is a lighthouse beam, a set of seemingly impossible rules, and the courage of ordinary people willing to hold the line against extraordinary threats. The sea remembers everything it has claimed, but it also respects the boundaries that have been drawn in light and stone and human determination, at least for now.